In the dust and grit of the Texas frontier, a lone drifter named Jack Talbot rides into the small, sleepy town of Dry Creek. His quiet demeanor and unassuming presence draw the attention of a gang of bandits looking to make their mark. They think little of Jack, believing him to be just another wanderer, easy prey for their ruthless game. But they've made a deadly mistake. What they don't know is that Jack Talbot isn't a man to be underestimated. He's the fastest gun in the West, and when he's pushed too far, he'll show them just how dangerous a quiet drifter can be. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. The sun hung low in the sky over the dry Texas plains, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. A slow, dusty wind swept across the town of Dry Creek, carrying with it the scent of the wild and untamed land. The town was quiet, too quiet for some. The kind of place where folks kept to themselves, where a stranger could walk in and not be noticed for days, maybe weeks. The kind of place where a man could disappear. And that's just what Jack Talbot had in mind. Jack had been riding for days, the weight of his old saddle leather creaking with every movement, the worn soles of his boots scuffing against the dirt path that led into town. His horse, a tired-looking brown mare, stumbled along, just as exhausted as her rider. Jack hadn't said much to anyone for the past few days, not since he left the last town behind. His life had become a quiet one, a lonely one. No one asked questions when you traveled the way he did, keeping to the back roads, moving through towns like shadows. The only thing that mattered now was keeping his head down and moving forward. The saloon was the first place he headed. It was a habit, one that Jack had picked up over the years. There was always a good chance of finding someone who might offer a meal, a drink, and, if you were lucky, a bit of conversation. Sometimes, it was just a place to rest for the night. Jack entered the saloon without a word, the door creaking as he pushed it open. The noise of a dozen conversations died away as the few patrons inside turned to look at him. It wasn't anything new. The quiet drifter in a town full of strangers. A man in his mid-30s, with a face lined by the sun and years of hardship, his dark hair falling over his brow in a way that spoke of a life lived on the move. He tipped his hat slightly, acknowledging the looks, but said nothing as he made his way to the bar. The bartender, a wiry man with a thick mustache, eyed him warily, but didn't speak either. Jack set his hat down on the bar and ordered a whiskey. He wasn't sure what he expected when he entered Dry Creek, but it wasn't this. The saloon was filled with the typical assortment of frontier folks: cowboys, farmers, drifters, and the occasional town character. Each one wrapped up in their own quiet conversations, their lives more or less inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the bartender's hands trembled as he poured the drink. The way the men at the back of the room were watching him now, their glances fleeting but deliberate. There was a moment of quiet before a voice broke through the stillness, low and mocking. "Well, looky here. A stranger." Jack didn't turn, but he could hear the movement behind him, the sound of boots scraping across the wood floor. A figure moved up beside him, a tall man wearing a worn-out brown hat and a dusty red bandana covering his neck. He grinned down at Jack, his teeth yellow against the dark stubble on his face. The man was one of the three bandits who had been sitting in the corner of the saloon, talking low and laughing at something between them. Now, they had all shifted their attention to Jack, sizing him up like hungry wolves circling their prey. Jack didn't respond, but his hand brushed against the grip of his Colt .45, hidden beneath his coat. He wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation, but he knew the type of men who lived on the frontier. Men who liked to make a name for themselves by pushing others around. Jack had seen enough of them to know how they operated, and he knew that once they started, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The bandit leaning against the bar chuckled, clearly amused by Jack's silence. He leaned in closer, his voice thick with mockery. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen a man like you around here. You come from the East? Or are you just a man who's got no place to go?" Jack took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving the glass. The warmth of the alcohol burned down his throat, but his hands remained steady. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response. "You don't talk much, do you?" The man continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "I like that. Makes you look real mysterious." The bandit straightened up, eyeing Jack from head to toe. The others in the corner had started to gather around now, their eyes fixed on the drifter, each of them sizing him up, waiting for something to happen. "You've got the look of a man who's seen his share of trouble," the bandit said with a grin. "Maybe you're just passing through. Or maybe you're here for something else." He chuckled again, and Jack could feel the heat rising in the room. The mocking tone in the bandit's voice was a challenge, a provocation. The kind of provocation that had a way of leading to trouble. Jack's gaze never lifted from the glass in front of him. He could feel the bandit's eyes boring into him, waiting for a reaction, but he didn't give them one. His mind was calm, steady. He'd been through this before. He knew the game. They wanted a reaction, wanted to see if they could push him to the edge. The tension in the air thickened. It was only a matter of time before one of them decided to make a move. Jack had learned long ago not to let it get that far. Finally, without a word, he placed his glass down on the bar and stood up slowly. The bandit took a step back, clearly expecting a confrontation, but Jack's hand never moved from his side. He wasn't drawing his gun. Not yet. He turned toward the men at the table and met their gaze. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not in this town. Not to men like them. Jack Talbot had never been one for loud words or empty threats. But when it came to the frontier, there was only one thing that spoke loud enough to stop a fight before it started. His gun. The room was thick with tension, as if the very air had turned heavy, filled with the unspoken promise of violence. Jack Talbot stood there, calm and unyielding, not looking at the men around him but sensing every one of them. Their movements, their postures, their intentions. He knew the game, had played it 100 times before. He wasn't here for a fight, but when trouble knocked, Jack wasn't the kind of man to turn his back on it. The bandit, who had been leaning against the bar, stood straighter now, his eyes narrowing with a mix of curiosity and amusement. He hadn't expected Jack to just stand there, to be so calm. Most men would have drawn their guns by now, or at least shown some sign of fear, but not Jack. There was a quiet intensity about him, something that made the bandits hesitate for the briefest of moments. Jack's eyes flicked toward the group of men standing in the corner of the saloon, watching him with eager, predatory glances. One of them was larger than the others, his shoulders broad and his stance solid, like a boulder waiting to crash down on anyone foolish enough to challenge him. The others, though smaller, were all wiry and quick. They had their guns tucked at their sides, hands resting near the grips, ready to draw at a moment's notice. But none of them made a move. They were waiting for something. Maybe for Jack to flinch. Maybe for him to say something, give them a reason to act. They weren't sure yet what kind of man he was. Jack wasn't one to speak unless it was necessary. He didn't need to say a word. His silence spoke volumes, sending a message that they could either stand down or face the consequences. The bandit at the bar seemed to sense it too, his grin slowly fading, replaced by the creeping realization that this wasn't the kind of drifter they could push around so easily. The bandit's hand hovered near his gun belt, and Jack could see the twitch of his fingers, the slight movement of muscle under his coat. He was testing Jack, seeing if he'd respond. If Jack made a move, they'd have an excuse to draw. But Jack was quicker than they realized. The quiet drifter was patient, his body still, waiting for the right moment, and he had learned that the fastest way to disarm a situation was often to let them make the first move. Finally, the large man in the corner took a step forward, his boots scraping across the wood floor with a soft but deliberate sound. He cracked his knuckles, a low sound that seemed to resonate in the quiet of the room. His eyes locked onto Jack, sizing him up, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. "You deaf or just plain stupid?" the large man growled, his voice rough with the kind of menace that came from years of living by violence. "We're talking to you, and you're just standing there like a damn fool." Jack didn't answer right away. He simply stood, his posture relaxed but ready, his hand never leaving the holster on his right hip. The tension in the room was palpable, the kind that had a way of making everyone feel like they were walking a fine line between life and death. The bandits were circling now, their bodies slightly angled toward him, their hands on their guns, but not quite drawing. The large man took another step closer, his breath shallow, trying to intimidate Jack with his size. "I asked you a question, Drifter. You don't get to just walk in here and ignore me." The quiet hum of the saloon seemed to vanish as the other men held their breath, watching the exchange. The barkeep, who had been silent up to this point, glanced nervously between the bandits and Jack, unsure if he should say something or just let the inevitable happen. Jack's eyes flicked briefly toward the large man, but there was no fear in his gaze, no sign of aggression either. His focus was razor-sharp, every sense trained on the men around him. Then, in a single, fluid motion, Jack's right hand shot to his gun, drawing it with the speed of a striking snake, and in the blink of an eye, the barrel of his Colt .45 was aimed directly at the large man's chest. The room seemed to freeze. The large man's hand was still on his own gun, but Jack's was already faster. The bandit's eyes went wide with shock as he realized how close he had come to making a fatal mistake. Jack didn't flinch, didn't give an inch. His gun was steady, aimed perfectly at the man's chest. He didn't have to say a word. The large man stood frozen for a moment longer, his breath coming faster, his fingers twitching. Jack could see the man weighing his options, realizing that he wasn't the one in control anymore. The other bandits tensed, their hands still resting on their guns, but none of them made a move. Jack's voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a whip. "I don't take kindly to being mocked," he said, his tone calm, cold. "And I don't take kindly to being pushed around." The large man's hand twitched, his fingers still hovering near his gun. It was clear that he wasn't ready to back down, but he also knew that if he drew now, it would be his last mistake. The silence stretched between them, each man reading the other. And then, slowly, the large man took his hand off his gun, a tight-lipped sneer curling on his face. "You're fast, I'll give you that," the large man muttered, backing away slowly. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, but Jack had made his point. There would be no fight today. Jack didn't lower his gun until the man had taken another few steps back. His eyes stayed on him, focused and unwavering. As the large man moved to rejoin his friends, Jack's gaze flicked briefly to the others, who stood a little straighter now, their hands still close to their guns, but none of them made a move. Jack's voice was quiet but firm. "You can leave now," he said, "or you can stay and see how it ends. The choice is yours." The bandits exchanged glances, the unspoken message clear between them. The large man gave one last glance at Jack, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and frustration, but after a moment of hesitation, he turned and walked out of the saloon, followed closely by the rest of his gang. The door swung shut behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. Jack holstered his gun and returned to his seat at the bar, his face as unreadable as it had been when he first walked in. The barkeep gave him a nervous nod, but Jack didn't respond. He wasn't here for a fight. He wasn't here for anything but to pass through. And as the sound of the bandits' retreating footsteps faded into the distance, the tension in the saloon seemed to lift, the other patrons slowly returning to their quiet conversations, trying to forget the brief moment when the drifter had shown them what real danger looked like. Jack Talbot, the quiet drifter, had just made his point. The tension in the saloon slowly began to dissipate, but Jack could still feel the eyes of the patrons on him. They tried to pretend like they were minding their own business, but the whispers were unmistakable. Some of them were still trying to figure out what had just happened. How the quiet drifter had so effortlessly disarmed a group of men who had been trying to pick a fight. Jack didn't care. He wasn't looking for a reputation. He wasn't even looking for trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him. And when it did, Jack Talbot always made sure it didn't get the better of him. His gaze drifted to the door, where the sound of boots in the snow echoed into the quiet room. The bandits had left, but Jack knew they weren't done. They wouldn't be satisfied with the way things had ended. They never were. The bartender had kept his distance, clearly not wanting to provoke Jack any further. He stood by the counter, cleaning a glass with a rag, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. Jack took another sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid burning his throat as he set the glass back down. The quiet was welcome, but it was also unnerving. The storm outside still raged, the wind howling against the saloon walls, but inside, it felt as though the very air was holding its breath. It wouldn't take long before the bandits regrouped, but Jack wasn't in the mood for waiting. A figure suddenly appeared in the doorway, and Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. His eyes narrowed, but his body remained still. The man in the doorway was tall, his silhouette framed by the blizzard outside. His coat was long, a dark, heavy thing that hung loosely around his broad frame. He stepped inside with the ease of someone accustomed to trouble, his boots making a soft crunch against the wooden floor. The saloon fell silent again. The man scanned the room with a quick sweep of his eyes before his gaze landed on Jack. He didn't look like a bandit, but in places like this, looks could be deceiving. "Got a minute?" the man asked, his voice low, rough, but not unfriendly. Jack didn't reply right away. Instead, he took another slow sip from his glass, never breaking eye contact with the newcomer. The man didn't seem threatened by Jack, but he didn't seem too comfortable either. "I'm listening," Jack said finally, his voice calm but firm. He didn't ask for trouble, but he was more than capable of dealing with it when it came knocking. The man hesitated for a moment before pulling up a chair and sitting down across from Jack. He didn't make any move to shake hands or offer pleasantries. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his hands resting on the table, his eyes sharp with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Name's Willard," he said, his tone blunt but steady. "I heard what happened with those bandits." Jack didn't respond, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of his glass. Willard paused, as if waiting for Jack to speak. But when it became clear that he wouldn't, he continued. "You're the one who made them back down, right?" Willard asked. "Word travels fast around here. They don't take kindly to losing a fight." Jack didn't care much for small talk, and he didn't care for people trying to pry into his business. But he wasn't about to let the man sit there and ask questions without answering a few of his own. "What's your interest in it?" Jack asked, his tone flat. Willard smirked slightly, though there was no humor in it. "I've got no interest, Peresi, but I know men like those, and I know the kind of trouble they cause. If you're planning on sticking around, you might want to reconsider." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Willard leaned back slightly, the creaking of the chair echoing in the quiet room. "They've got more friends, and when they come back, they won't be looking to walk away this time. They'll be gunning for you." Jack could feel the weight of Willard's words settling into his chest. He had already known it, had already expected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. He could feel the bandits' anger building, simmering under the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. The quiet drifter had made his point, but it seemed the bandits weren't done yet. Jack didn't show any emotion, but internally, he was already calculating his next move. His past had been full of moments like this. He'd been in situations where walking away was impossible, where running wasn't an option, and he knew that Dry Creek wasn't going to be any different. "So what's your plan?" Willard asked, breaking Jack's train of thought. Jack looked at him then, his gaze steady. Willard had asked the question, but the answer wasn't one that Jack was going to give away so easily. Jack wasn't a man of many words, and he wasn't about to reveal his hand to someone he didn't trust. "I don't plan on making any more noise than necessary," Jack replied coolly, his voice almost a whisper over the rumble of the storm outside. "But when trouble comes looking for me, I deal with it." Willard seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the door as if he were waiting for someone. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like an angry beast trying to tear down the walls of the saloon. "I'd watch your back if I were you," Willard said finally, standing up from his chair. "You've made your point, but they don't take kindly to a man embarrassing them. Especially not a man who walks in here with no name and no reason." Jack remained still as Willard made his way toward the door, the sound of his boots fading into the wind as he left the saloon. The door swung open with a creak, then slammed shut behind him, leaving Jack alone with the whiskey and the sound of the storm. It was clear now that the bandits wouldn't give up so easily. They would be back. Jack didn't have to wait for them to make their move. He knew they'd come, but Jack wasn't the type of man to sit back and wait. He was a man of action. The clock was ticking, and Jack Talbot would be ready when it ran out. The sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder as the wind howled against the walls of the saloon. But inside, Jack remained as calm as ever. The whiskey sat untouched on the counter, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as the flickering candlelight cast a soft glow across the room. The storm outside was as relentless as the bandits would be when they returned, but Jack wasn't one to rush into things. He had seen enough to know that sometimes patience was just as dangerous as drawing your gun too quickly. He wiped his hands on his coat, the worn leather smooth against his palms. His fingers itched, the weight of his revolver resting under his coat where no one could see it. But Jack didn't move for it. Not yet. The bandits had made their first mistake, underestimating him, and now they would make another. It was only a matter of time. Jack had always been a man who preferred to let his actions speak louder than his words. And this time, he wasn't going to let the bandits think they could intimidate him. If they wanted trouble, he'd give it to them. But not until they made their move. It was then that the door opened again, the storm's fury pushing it inward with a violent gust of wind. Jack didn't need to look up. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in the room's energy. He had been around long enough to know when a situation was about to escalate. The boots that hit the floor were heavier this time. The way they scraped the wood seemed deliberate, measured. He didn't turn to face the newcomer at first, but the silence in the room told him everything he needed to know. The man who walked in was different from the others. He wasn't a bandit, at least not in the same way. Jack could feel it in the air. The way the stranger carried himself, the way his eyes moved over the room with careful precision. The man walked toward the bar, nodding at Jack, acknowledging him without a word. He wasn't here for a fight. Not yet, at least. Whiskey, the man said, his voice low but steady. The bartender, his hands shaking, quickly poured a drink and slid it across the counter. The stranger took the glass without a word, tipping it back in one swift motion before setting it down. Jack still didn't speak. He didn't need to. He could feel the eyes on him now, the weight of the man's stare, but Jack didn't let it bother him. He had learned long ago to ignore the intimidation of strangers. In this world, everyone was a stranger until proven otherwise. The man turned to Jack, and for the first time, their eyes met. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if they both knew the same thing. There was no need for words. "You're the one who ran the bandits off, huh?" the stranger said, his voice still calm. But now there was a hint of something else. Curiosity, maybe, or respect. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. The stranger studied him for a long moment before continuing. "You're quick. I've seen men like you before. Men who don't talk much, but when they do, their actions speak louder than their words." Jack finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I don't talk unless it's necessary." The stranger chuckled, the sound low and dry. "I figured as much. But you should know, the bandits aren't the only ones who'll be looking for you." Jack didn't respond right away. The man's words sank into his mind, and he knew the truth of them. The bandits had their pride, and that would cost them. But there were always others. Others who didn't care about pride, who were just looking for a reason to draw blood. The stranger slid another drink across the counter and took a seat beside Jack, his eyes never leaving him. "Name's Hank," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unspoken weight. Jack didn't offer his name, didn't need to. Names were just labels for men who didn't want to be forgotten. Jack wasn't in the business of being remembered. "You know," Hank continued, leaning in slightly, "in a town like this, things don't stay quiet for long. You'll have more than just those bandits after you." Jack didn't flinch, didn't let the words rattle him. He'd seen enough men come and go in his time to know that people often spoke in half-truths, hoping to stir fear or curiosity. But Jack had no need for fear. He had only the now, the moment, and the certainty that the bandits weren't finished with him. And neither was anyone else who had a reason to make a name by taking him down. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind pushing against the wooden frame of the saloon, and for a moment, the room was bathed in a soft glow from the lanterns above, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. "You think you're ready for them?" Hank asked, his voice quieter now, like a challenge he was throwing out to test the drifter. Jack didn't need to ask who them were. He knew. It was always them, always the ones who would come in the dead of night, the ones who made a habit of looking for trouble and didn't stop until they found it. Jack's hand rested on the worn wood of the bar, his fingers grazing the edge of his glass. "I'm ready," he said simply. "I always am." There was a pause, an unspoken understanding between them. Hank didn't press him any further. They both knew that when the bandits returned, Jack would be waiting. And so would they. Jack stood slowly, pushing his chair back and rising to his full height. He didn't need to wait for the fight to come to him. He would bring it to them first. Hank watched him for a moment longer before he stood too, tipping his hat slightly as if in acknowledgement. "Good luck, Drifter," he said, his voice gruff. But there was something else behind it. A recognition that Jack wasn't just a man who wandered from town to town. He was a man who had earned his place among the toughest. "I don't need luck," Jack replied flatly, his eyes fixed on the door, the soft sound of wind still howling outside. He made his way to the exit, pausing just long enough to glance back at the saloon. Knowing the bandits were out there waiting, he wasn't going to let them have the advantage. They had no idea who they were up against. The wind slammed into Jack Talbot as soon as he stepped out of the saloon, pushing hard against his coat and whipping his dark hair into his eyes. Snow had begun to fall heavily, blanketing the town of Dry Creek in a thick, white fog, but Jack barely noticed. His eyes were focused, steady, scanning the empty street ahead of him. The saloon's door closed behind him with a soft creak, the noise swallowed by the storm, leaving the town eerily silent. Jack's boots crunched in the fresh snow as he walked down the middle of the street, his pace measured but deliberate. He could feel the bandits' eyes on him even now, their gaze like shadows lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jack wasn't a man who waited. The wind howled across the street, swirling around Jack, making the air cold and thick with the bite of winter. It was the kind of night where men like the ones inside the saloon, the kind that lived for power, intimidation, and blood, would be looking for trouble. Jack had no doubt they would be back soon. They'd find a way to lick their wounds, regroup, and come for him again. They had pride to restore, and men like them didn't let things slide without consequence. His hand rested lightly on the grip of his Colt .45 at his side. The weight was comforting. He'd never liked to carry a weapon, but in a world like this, it was a necessity. His coat flapped around him as he made his way to the edge of town, just beyond the last few houses, where the woods began to rise up toward the hills. That's where the bandits would make their stand. He could feel it in his gut, and he wouldn't let them surprise him. His mind was clear as he walked, every step bringing him closer to the confrontation that would come in the next few hours. He wasn't afraid. He had long ago learned to silence the part of him that reacted with fear. But the stillness of the town, the oppressive weight of the storm, gave him a sense of unease. It felt like something was coming, something more than just the bandits. He paused, his eyes flicking to the horizon where the trees began to darken against the white sky. He could hear the faint sound of hoofbeats on the frozen earth, but it was too far off for him to tell whether it was one rider or more. It wasn't unusual for travelers to move through this part of the country, but in a place like Dry Creek, anyone moving this way during the winter storm was either lost or looking for trouble. Jack turned toward the sound and took a few more measured steps forward. His instincts were sharp, honed over years of surviving in places like this. He felt the storm press in around him, the silence on the wind making everything feel too still. But he didn't move faster. His pace was steady, measured. The faint sound of hooves grew louder, and Jack's hand went to his revolver, though he didn't draw it yet. The last thing he needed was to start shooting at shadows. He needed to see who was coming. A figure emerged from the storm, riding a horse at a steady pace. The rider's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but Jack could tell from the way they rode that it was a man with purpose. His coat flapped in the wind, and the horse's hooves made deep impressions in the snow. Jack didn't draw his gun yet, but his body was ready. The man drew closer, his horse moving slower as he saw Jack standing in the middle of the street. Jack's gaze never wavered, his eyes sharp as he appraised the newcomer. The man pulled his horse to a stop a few feet away from Jack, his face obscured by the snow and shadows. "You're the one they've been talking about," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, like someone who had been through enough to know how to survive. "The Drifter." Jack didn't reply immediately, studying the man for a moment. There was something familiar about him, but Jack couldn't quite place it. The man was clearly armed, a rifle slung over his shoulder and a pistol holstered at his hip, the kind of gear someone would wear if they were expecting trouble. "I heard you made quite an impression in the saloon," the man continued, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. The bandits didn't take too kindly to that. Jack didn't flinch. He had no reason to. He was a man of few words, but in moments like this, words were useless anyway. Action was what spoke loudest in this world. "So it seems," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. The man leaned back in his saddle slightly, eyes narrowing. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you should know they'll come for you again. All of them. They're pissed." Jack's eyes shifted slightly, his hand still resting near his gun. "I know." The man seemed to consider Jack for a moment, then let out a low laugh. "You sure know how to stay calm. They didn't teach you to fear, did they?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He didn't fear the bandits. Not the ones in Dry Creek, at least. He had learned to live by his own code, one that didn't involve fear or hesitation. The man looked at him for a moment longer, then slowly dismounted. He took a few steps forward, lowering his hand to rest on the butt of his pistol, though he still didn't draw it. Jack's hand tightened, just slightly around the grip of his revolver. "They're still out there," the man said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "They'll be coming soon, and you won't be able to stand up to all of them. I've seen men like you, men who think they can handle everything on their own." Jack's lips twitched slightly, but he didn't say anything. The man was right in one sense. Jack knew he wouldn't be able to take on the entire gang alone, but he wasn't planning on fighting alone. There were others in Dry Creek who had seen what happened in the saloon. Some of them were too afraid to act, but others, they would come around when the time was right. The stranger took one more step toward Jack, the wind picking up around them, and then stopped, studying him with cold eyes. "You really think you're gonna be the one to take them down?" he asked, his voice tinged with something between mockery and respect. Jack's eyes didn't leave the stranger's, and for a moment, the two of them stood there, as the storm raged around them. "Maybe," Jack said, his voice steady. "Maybe I'm just the man who's ready for the job." The wind howled around them, a distant, mournful sound that seemed to shake the very bones of Dry Creek. Snow continued to fall in thick sheets, swallowing the small town whole. The saloon, once the bustling heart of the settlement, now felt like a hollow shell, a refuge from the storm but also a place of quiet tension. Jack Talbot didn't need to speak. The stranger, still standing a few feet from him, was studying him with something between curiosity and wariness. Jack knew that look well. The man had seen enough trouble to know that Jack wasn't like the other drifters who wandered through towns like Dry Creek. He had the calm of someone who'd survived the worst the world had to offer and wasn't afraid of facing more of it. The stranger finally broke the silence, his voice low, but carrying enough weight to make Jack listen. "They won't be here immediately, but when they come, you'll need more than just yourself to handle them. I know where they're holed up, somewhere outside of town in the woods." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't move. He was still as a stone, his hand resting lightly on the gun at his side, but his mind was sharp, processing the man's words. "What's your interest in this?" Jack asked, his voice soft but direct. "You come in here and warn me, but I don't see the reason. What's your angle?" The stranger took a deep breath, and for a moment, his eyes shifted to the horizon, as though contemplating how much to reveal. The snow and wind carried a strange sense of finality in the air, like the storm was the calm before the inevitable. "Like I said, I've seen men like you," the stranger replied, his voice quiet. "Men who think they can stand alone against everything the world throws at them. I was the same once, and I learned the hard way that you can't always win on your own." Jack didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't trust easy words, didn't trust anyone who spoke too much. People often had a hidden reason for offering help, but the truth was, Jack wasn't used to help. He didn't know how to ask for it, or even accept it. Still, there was something about the stranger that made Jack pause, something in his tone, the way he carried himself. He had the air of a man who wasn't used to lying. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years spent walking this dangerous path. "You want something from me?" The stranger hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. Not a thing. Not from you. But there's a reason those men are after you now. They've seen what you're capable of. They won't let it go. Jack gave a single nod, his eyes scanning the man's face. He wasn't sure if this stranger was offering genuine help or if he was just trying to make some sort of deal, but Jack wasn't about to turn down a potential ally, not with the storm outside and the bandits closing in. "I'll take the information," Jack said, his voice sharp, "but I'll handle it my way." The stranger let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's what I thought you'd say." There was a moment of silence between them, the wind outside howling even louder as the storm intensified. The stranger seemed to be calculating something, his eyes flicking to the door and then back to Jack. His hand tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he didn't make any sudden moves. "Do you even know how many of them are out there?" the stranger asked, his eyes now studying Jack with an almost calculating gaze. Jack shook his head slowly. "I don't need to know. I know they're coming. And when they do, I'll be ready." The stranger considered him for a moment longer before nodding. "You're not wrong. I can tell you've fought battles before." He turned his back on Jack and walked toward the window, peering through the cracked wood, his eyes narrowing as he looked out into the storm. "But this fight, it won't be like the others. You'll need to be quicker, more strategic. They'll be here soon." Jack didn't move, but the tension in his body was growing. He could feel it in the way the storm raged around him, the heaviness in the air that said something was about to break. The bandits had taken too much pride in their victory at the saloon. They would be back, but they wouldn't come alone. "I've faced worse than them," Jack replied, his voice steady but carrying a hint of steel. "And if it comes to it, I'll handle it the way I always do." The stranger gave him a long, appraising look, but Jack could tell he was weighing his options. He didn't know if he'd seen enough of Jack's resolve to believe him, but there was little else to say. The sound of boots echoed in the distance, a light crunch of snow beneath heavy steps, growing louder as it approached. Jack turned toward the door, his body shifting into a more defensive stance, his eyes narrowing, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The stranger moved toward the door, stopping just short of the frame. He glanced back at Jack, and the two men exchanged a silent understanding. The bandits were coming. "Get ready," the stranger muttered, just loud enough for Jack to hear. Jack didn't need any further warning. His gun was already in his hand, ready for the inevitable showdown. The saloon was about to become a battleground, and the time for hesitation had passed. The wind was howling outside, and the storm raged against the town. But Jack knew it was only the beginning. The bandits weren't done, not by a long shot. The crunch of boots in the snow grew louder. Each step seemed to echo through the stillness of the storm. Jack's eyes were sharp, narrowing as he focused on the door. The wind howled louder, pushing the cold air into the saloon through every crack and crevice. The warmth of the fire behind him felt like it was growing distant, the hearth's crackling fading as the tension inside Jack's chest tightened. He didn't need to look over his shoulder to know that the stranger was still there, watching the door with the same careful eyes. Neither man spoke. There was no need. Both understood what was coming. The footsteps stopped just outside the saloon, and then the sound of the door handle turning reached Jack's ears. The bandits were close, too close now to back down. They had come to finish what they had started, and they weren't going to leave Dry Creek without a fight. Jack's hand tightened around the grip of his revolver. He didn't want to kill, but he would if it came down to it. His mind was focused, sharp. He had spent years fighting men like these, learning how to survive in a world where violence was the currency of respect. And in Dry Creek, respect was a rare commodity. The doors swung open with a groan, and the wind howled through the opening, pushing the thick snow in with it. For a brief moment, the room was a blur of white, the storm outside threatening to overtake everything inside. But Jack's eyes never wavered from the doorway, and then they walked in. The first was the large man, the one who had been leading the bandits in the saloon earlier. His eyes were wild with anger now, his face flushed, the wound from earlier still fresh. But the arrogance was still there, and it made Jack's stomach twist with irritation. He was followed by two more of the bandits, both smaller but equally dangerous, their hands resting on the butts of their guns. The fourth man, the one who had been with them in the saloon but hadn't said much, lingered at the back of the group, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for its prey. The bandits had come to finish the job, and Jack could see it in their eyes. "Well, well," the large man said, his voice thick with anger, but also with something else, an edge of amusement. "Seems like you don't know when to quit, do ya, Drifter?" Jack didn't say anything. His revolver stayed in his hand, but it didn't move toward the bandits just yet. He wasn't going to let them get the first move. Not again. The large man stepped forward, his boots thudding against the wooden floor with each step, until he was standing directly across from Jack. The others flanked him, spreading out and giving Jack just enough space to make his move. But Jack knew he didn't need much space. Not with the speed he had. "You made a big mistake back at the saloon," the large man continued, a grin curling on his lips as he looked Jack up and down. "You think you can come in here, embarrass us in front of everyone, and just walk away?" Jack didn't respond. His silence was enough of an answer. The man's grin faltered, but the bandit didn't seem to mind the lack of respect. Instead, he turned slightly to one of his companions and nodded. "I think it's time we teach this quiet bastard a lesson," the large man said, the words dripping with malice. In the blink of an eye, the bandit closest to Jack reached for his gun. But Jack was faster. The room seemed to freeze for a split second, and then, before the bandit could even draw, Jack's Colt .45 was already out of its holster and pointed at the man's chest. The bandit's hand froze mid-motion, his eyes wide with shock. He hadn't expected it. None of them had. "You made a mistake," Jack said, his voice calm, almost detached. "One you're not gonna walk away from." The large man laughed, but it was a nervous sound, his eyes flicking between Jack and his partner. "You think you can take all of us on, huh?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I don't care how fast you are, we've got numbers on our side." Jack's gaze never left the man's, and his finger rested lightly on the trigger of his revolver. He didn't need to rush this. He had all the time in the world. "I don't need numbers," Jack replied flatly. "I only need one shot." The bandits shifted, their hands twitching toward their guns, but Jack was already in motion. With the speed of a man who had practiced this move 1,000 times, he fired. The first bandit's body jerked backward as the bullet hit him square in the chest, and before the sound of the gunshot had even fully registered, Jack's revolver was already back in its holster. The bandits didn't have time to react. They were too slow. The man who had drawn first was already on the floor, his body slumped awkwardly in a heap, the blood already beginning to pool around him. The remaining bandits froze. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly agape, the realization hitting them just a moment too late. They weren't dealing with some random drifter, some easy mark. They were up against someone who could take them out in an instant. But the large man wasn't done yet. He let out a low growl of frustration, his hand resting on his gun as he took a step forward. The tension in the room crackled, and the other two bandits moved to flank him, hoping for the right moment to act. Jack stood tall, unfazed by their movements. He wasn't going to let them dictate this fight. It was his. "Last chance," Jack said, his voice cold. "I'll give you a way out. You walk out that door, and I'll let you go. Otherwise..." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The bandits' eyes flicked to one another, and Jack could see the hesitation in their faces. They had been so sure of themselves before, but now they weren't so sure. The large man took one final step forward, drawing his gun. His eyes locked onto Jack's with the intensity of a man who wasn't ready to back down. "I'd rather die than run from you, Drifter," the man sneered. Jack's hand was already on his gun, his fingers brushing the grip. The bandits were about to learn the hard way that running from him wasn't an option. The tension in the room was unbearable. The wind outside howled like a wild animal, rattling the old saloon's wooden frame. But inside, the only sound was the soft shuffle of boots on the floor, the creaking of the large man's hand slowly wrapping around the grip of his revolver. His eyes were locked onto Jack with a burning intensity, a desperation fueled by pride and anger. The other two bandits flanked him, their hands twitching near their own weapons, but neither of them dared to make a move just yet. Jack's stance was as calm as ever, but his mind was razor-sharp, every muscle coiled, ready for the inevitable. He had been in this situation before, too many times to count, and he knew what was coming. The large man would make his move first. That was always the way. The ones who thought they were in control would never wait. Jack didn't flinch. His right hand hovered just above the holster, his fingers resting lightly against the leather. His gaze was steady on the large man, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. The room seemed to stretch out, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced like ghosts around them. The weight of the moment pressed down on Jack, but he didn't let it show. He had been through worse. Then, with a growl, the large man made his move. The sound of the man's coat swishing was barely audible before the man's hand shot down to his holster, his fingers moving with the raw instinct of a man who had drawn a gun 1,000 times. But Jack was already faster. His body moved with precision, as if the world had slowed to his rhythm, as if time itself had bent to his will. In a single, fluid motion, Jack's Colt .45 was out of its holster, and the sharp crack of the gunshot split the air like thunder. The large man's body jerked backward with the force of the bullet hitting him in the chest. His eyes widened in shock, and for a brief moment, he seemed suspended in time. His body frozen in mid-movement before it collapsed to the ground in a heap of twisted limbs and blood-soaked snow. The room was deathly silent for a heartbeat. Jack's gun was already back in its holster before the sound of the man's body hitting the floor had even fully registered in the air. The other two bandits stood frozen, their eyes wide, their guns still tucked against their hips, but the moment had already passed. The large man, the leader, was dead before he hit the floor, and the weight of that finality settled over the saloon like the storm outside. Sudden, relentless, and unforgiving. The second bandit, smaller and quicker, reached for his gun with a desperation that bordered on panic, but Jack was already moving. His left hand was at his side, his revolver drawn, and the second bandit never even had a chance to pull his gun before Jack's bullet found its mark, tearing through the man's arm and sending him to the ground with a howl of pain. The bandit struggled to breathe as he clutched his shoulder, but the damage was done. Jack took a single step forward, his eyes fixed on the last bandit standing. The man was already backing up, his hands held up in surrender, but the fear in his eyes was all Jack needed to see. The bandit knew the truth now. He knew that he had lost. "Please," the man gasped, his voice shaking. "I didn't want this. I didn't." But Jack didn't let him finish. His left hand flicked to the side, and the final shot rang out, silencing the bandit's plea before it even reached the air. The man fell to the floor, his body crumpling like a rag doll, the weight of his life extinguished in an instant. Jack stood still, the barrel of his gun still smoking from the last shot, but he didn't move to holster it just yet. He needed a moment. The room was silent except for the wind and the low creaking of the saloon's wooden walls. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, and Jack let it settle around him as he looked at the three men lying dead on the floor. He had done what he came here to do. They wouldn't bother him again. Jack's hand slowly moved back to his coat pocket, retrieving the small flask he kept hidden there. He unscrewed the cap with practiced ease, the scent of whiskey rising to his nose as he took a long, slow swig. The burn of the alcohol settled in his throat, and for a moment, the weight of everything seemed to lift. The storm outside hadn't stopped, but in this moment, Jack was at peace. He wasn't here for a fight. But when trouble came knocking, Jack Talbot wasn't the kind of man to shy away from it. He had faced too much in his life to let fear control him. And when those bandits came for him, they had learned just how fast a quiet drifter could make them regret their decisions. The saloon door swung open again, and this time, there was no hesitation. Jack didn't even turn to look. He knew who it was. The bartender stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shaking as he clutched a rifle. The man had clearly seen what had happened in the saloon, but he didn't seem to know what to do with it. "They're all dead," Jack said, his voice flat. "I didn't kill them because I wanted to, but they didn't leave me much choice." The bartender took a hesitant step forward, his eyes flicking to the bodies at Jack's feet, the blood already soaking into the floorboards. I didn't expect. I didn't know you." Jack cut him off with a look, his expression unreadable. "It's done. You can lock the door. If anyone else comes looking for trouble, They'll find the same thing. The bartender nodded quickly, his eyes wide, and without saying another word, he turned and bolted the door behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like a finality, and Jack allowed himself one last breath of relief. He wasn't a man of many words, but in this world, his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. And tonight, the world had heard him loud and clear. The saloon was quieter now. The wind outside howled relentlessly, but within the old walls of the building, it was a different kind of quiet, a heavy one. The kind that settles in after something significant has happened. The kind of silence that followed a violent reckoning. Jack stood by the bar, his back against the counter as he finished the last of his whiskey. The glass was empty now, the warmth of the alcohol fading quickly, leaving only the lingering taste of oak and bitterness on his tongue. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to drink. It didn't change what had happened, but it had been a long time since he'd been in a situation like this, where the consequences were so immediate. The bartender, still unnerved by the gunfight that had just unfolded before him, nervously cleaned the counter with a rag. His eyes kept flicking to the bodies sprawled out on the floor, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped the wood in slow, careful circles. Jack didn't move, though he could feel the bartender's gaze on him. It was the kind of look a man gives when he's unsure whether to thank you for saving his life or curse you for the bloodshed you brought into his place of business. But Jack wasn't in the mood to talk about it. "Why didn't you run?" Jack asked suddenly, his voice low and soft. The question had been on his mind since the moment he'd taken out the bandits, and now it seemed like a good time to ask. The bartender froze for a moment, his hands stilling on the rag. He glanced up at Jack, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Run? Where to?" he said, as if the answer was as obvious as the storm outside. "I ain't got anywhere to run. Not now." Jack's eyes studied the man for a moment, the silence between them stretching just long enough for the weight of the words to settle in. The bartender wasn't just a man trying to avoid trouble. He was a man stuck in the middle of it. Someone who had no choice but to face whatever came next. Jack didn't speak again. There was no need. He had already figured out that much. The storm outside hadn't just brought the cold. It had brought this town's trouble with it. The bandits hadn't been the only ones to arrive in Dry Creek that night. Trouble always found its way to places like this, no matter how quiet or unassuming they might seem. But the quiet didn't last long. A faint creak sounded from the door, followed by the muffled sound of boots crunching through the snow. Someone was coming. Jack could feel it, his instincts kicking in as his eyes snapped to the door. It wasn't the sound of a man who was just passing through. It was someone who had a purpose, someone who was determined. He didn't move. The bartender's eyes widened as he looked nervously toward the door, his hand tightening on the rag in his hands. Jack's gaze never left the door, his muscles coiling in preparation. This time, it was different. The door didn't swing open in the same way the bandits had entered earlier. This time, whoever was coming wasn't making a show of it. It was the kind of entrance that suggested they already knew what was waiting for them. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure stepped inside, their silhouette barely visible against the bright white snowstorm outside. The light from the lanterns inside the saloon flickered across the figure's face, revealing just enough for Jack to get a glimpse of who they were. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had seen and done things that most people would never even imagine. His coat was thick, dark, and stained with the kind of dirt that only came from long days on the trail. His face was rugged, covered in stubble, with deep-set eyes that glinted coldly in the dim light. He stepped into the room without hesitation, his boots clicking firmly against the wooden floor as he made his way toward the bar. The bartender stood frozen behind the counter, unsure of what to do, but Jack wasn't fazed. He had already assessed the situation. The man didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. Jack could feel his eyes scanning the room, taking in the bodies, the blood on the floor, the tension in the air. This man was no stranger to violence. He wasn't intimidated by the sight of death. He had probably seen more than his share. The stranger's gaze flicked to Jack, but Jack didn't move. He knew better than to react to the first sign of aggression. Instead, he just waited. The man took a moment, his gaze lingering, before he spoke. "You're the drifter," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of 100 unspoken words. There was no question in his tone, just an undeniable certainty. "I've heard about you." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man had already made his assumptions. And Jack didn't care to explain himself to someone who likely wouldn't understand. The stranger stepped closer, and now, Jack could see the gun strapped to his side, the worn leather of the holster frayed at the edges, the way it hung from his belt like something used often. This man was here for a reason. Jack could sense it. "You made the mistake of showing up in the wrong town," the stranger continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "And you made a bigger mistake by killing those men." Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, but his hand didn't move toward his gun. He wasn't surprised by the confrontation. He had expected something like this. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for retribution. "The mistake was theirs," Jack replied, his voice steady. "Not mine." The stranger's lips twitched in the faintest smile, but it was more of a grimace than anything else. "Maybe, but that doesn't mean you're not gonna pay for it." The air between them seemed to thicken, the weight of the words hanging in the air like a storm on the brink of breaking. Jack didn't back down. He wasn't about to give the stranger the satisfaction of seeing fear or hesitation. The bartender shifted uneasily behind the counter, his eyes darting back and forth between Jack and the stranger. He had been waiting for this moment, for the confrontation that would either bring more blood or leave them both walking away with the same cold silence. Jack could feel the tension building again, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. It was time. The stranger's hand moved slowly toward his gun, his fingers resting lightly on the leather of his holster. Jack didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He had seen men like this before. Men who thought they could intimidate, men who lived off the idea that they had control over the moment. The wind howled outside, pushing against the walls of the saloon, but inside, the air had grown thick, like the calm before a storm. The bartender behind the counter didn't know what to do, his hands shaking slightly as they gripped the rack. Jack could feel the man's eyes, sharp and calculating, studying him as if waiting for him to make a mistake. The stranger's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You've got guts, Drifter. I'll give you that," he said, his voice low, almost too calm for comfort. "But I've seen men with guts like yours. Men who thought they could just walk into town and take what they wanted, only to end up with a bullet in their chest." Jack's gaze never wavered. He had been through this exact situation more times than he cared to count, and every time, the result was the same. A man who underestimated him was a man who didn't leave the room alive. "You're wrong," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, like a man who had accepted that violence was always just around the corner. "I didn't come here to take anything, but if you're looking for trouble, I'll be happy to oblige." The stranger's hand twitched again, and the subtle movement told Jack everything he needed to know. This man was ready to draw, to make his move, but Jack wasn't going to let him dictate the pace of the fight. He had already made his decision. Without warning, Jack's hand shot to his holster. The shot rang out, sharp and echoing in the saloon. But the man was already falling backward, his own gun barely halfway out of his holster before the bullet caught him in the shoulder. The force of the shot spun him off balance, and he crashed to the floor with a groan of pain, his hand instinctively clutching at the wound. For a brief moment, the room seemed frozen, suspended in time. The stranger's body lay twitching on the ground, the blood seeping into the floorboards, his gun now a few feet away from his hand. Jack didn't even look down at him. His gaze was fixed on the remaining bandits, who stood stock still, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape. Jack's revolver was still smoking from the shot, but his hand was already back at his side, ready. The silence stretched for a long, tense moment as the two remaining men exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this, not from a quiet drifter. Jack's voice cut through the stillness, low but commanding. "You've got a choice. You can leave now, and I'll let you walk. Or you can stay and see how this ends." The bandits didn't move at first, and Jack could feel their hesitation. They were already calculating, weighing their chances. He had taken down their leader with a single shot, but they were still alive. They still had a chance, but they weren't fast enough. The second bandit, the smaller one, reached for his gun, But Jack's hand was already in motion, his revolver out and aimed at the man's chest in an instant. The bandit froze, his fingers hovering just above the grip of his weapon. But Jack's eyes locked onto him with the cold precision of a man who had already made up his mind. "Do it," Jack said, his voice quiet. "Make your move." The bandit's face twisted with uncertainty, and for a moment, Jack saw the fear behind the bravado. The man wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to die. But before the man could make up his mind, Jack's finger moved. The gunshot was almost drowned out by the howling wind outside, but it was clear enough. The bandit's body jerked back, his chest exploding with the force of the bullet, and he crumpled to the floor, his weapon falling from his hand. The last bandit, the one who had been lingering near the back of the room, looked between his fallen comrades and Jack, his hand still resting on his gun. Jack could see the fear in his eyes now, the understanding that he was the last one left standing. He was the one who had to decide whether to fight or to flee. For a long moment, the man said nothing. He looked at the door, then back at Jack, as if calculating how fast he could make it to safety. But he didn't make a move. Jack wasn't about to let him run. "Not now. You should have taken the chance to leave," Jack said softly, his voice like the calm before a thunderstorm. "But you didn't." The bandit's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Jack was faster. With a single, precise movement, Jack drew his gun again and fired. The man dropped to the ground with a final, gurgling breath, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. Jack stood there for a moment, the room heavy with silence, his revolver still smoking in his hand. The weight of the moment settled over him, but he didn't let it affect him. He had done what he came here to do. He had ended it. He turned toward the bartender, who stood frozen behind the counter, his face pale, his hands still shaking. Jack gave him a slight nod, acknowledging the man's presence but offering no comfort. Jack wasn't here to make friends. "You're safe," Jack said simply, his voice calm. He turned back toward the door, holstering his gun as he did. "But that's the last time I do your dirty work for you." With a final glance at the bodies lying in the saloon, Jack pushed the door open and stepped into the storm. The wind greeted him like an old friend. But Jack wasn't about to let the weather slow him down. He had business to take care of, and it wasn't finished yet. He didn't know what the stranger had wanted with him or why he'd intervened. But Jack wasn't about to worry about it now. His job had always been simple: survive, move forward, and keep his hands clean where possible. But as Jack walked into the storm, his mind was already racing ahead. There were other towns, other troublemakers out there, and Jack wasn't done yet. The wolves were still out there, and Jack Talbot was always ready to hunt. The snow was falling in thick sheets as Jack stepped into the street, the cold biting into his skin as the wind picked up again. His coat flapped against his legs with each step, but it didn't slow him down. He had already done what he needed to do in Dry Creek. The bandits were no longer a threat, and the storm outside wasn't going to stop him. He had seen too many towns like this, places where the wind howled and the violence simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to set it off. And when that spark came, when a man like Jack walked into town, the violence had a way of finding its way to the surface quickly. But it wasn't just violence he had been running from for all these years. It was the people who wanted him dead, the ones who had made it their life's work to see Jack Talbot fall. Jack had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to keep moving, to stay ahead of the storm. And now, as he walked down the snow-covered street, Jack knew that he wouldn't be staying in Dry Creek for long. He had no reason to. He didn't need the trouble. But the truth was, trouble had a way of following him. As Jack reached the edge of town, the wind began to pick up, making the snow swirl around his feet. He didn't look back at the saloon or the bodies left behind. He didn't need to. There was nothing left for him here. He had killed to survive, and that was all. That's how it worked on the frontier. But as Jack moved toward his horse, he heard a voice calling out to him, the sound carried by the wind. "Hey, stranger." Jack turned toward the voice, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. He had expected the bandits to come back for him, but it wasn't them this time. A man was walking toward him, his coat billowing behind him in the wind. He was tall, with a rough face that seemed as worn by time and experience as Jack's own. His hat was pulled low over his brow, and his hands rested easily on his hips, But Jack could tell that he wasn't a man looking for trouble. Jack didn't speak at first, just studying the stranger as he closed the distance between them. "I wasn't sure you'd make it out of there alive," the man said with a slow, knowing smile. "You sure made a mess in that saloon. They'll be talking about that for a while." Jack didn't respond, but his hand remained near the gun at his side. He didn't trust men like this. It was always better to be cautious. "You're the one they call Jack Talbot, right?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "Heard the name before. Figured I'd run into you eventually." Jack didn't say anything, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to gauge this new presence. He didn't like the way this man seemed to already know him, as though he had some preconceived notion of who Jack was, what he had done. Jack had lived his life as a drifter, a man who didn't get close to others, a man who kept his distance for a reason. But the stranger didn't seem like a typical gunslinger. He wasn't trying to provoke Jack, wasn't acting like he was ready to draw. Instead, he just stood there, eyes locked with Jack's, his posture relaxed but not complacent. "I'm not looking for trouble," the stranger said, his voice a little softer now. "I'm just here to give you a word of advice. There's a lot more trouble headed your way than you think." Jack's brow furrowed. This man wasn't a bandit, at least not in the conventional sense. He didn't carry himself like one. But Jack wasn't ready to trust anyone just yet. "I've had my fill of trouble," Jack replied, his voice steady. "I didn't come here looking for a fight, but it seems trouble has a way of finding me." The stranger smiled, but it wasn't a smile of humor. It was knowing, like a man who had seen it all before. "That's the thing about men like you, Jack. You've made your name, and now it's just a matter of time before someone comes looking to make their own." Jack's fingers tightened around his coat, but he didn't draw his weapon. This wasn't the time. The man hadn't made a move, hadn't shown any signs of hostility. But there was something about him, a familiarity in his tone, a quiet kind of authority that Jack had heard in other men before, men who had lived lives as rough as his own. "I've been running from trouble for years," Jack said, his voice low. "And every time, it seems like it catches up with me." The stranger nodded, his eyes never leaving Jack's. "That's the life you chose, isn't it? Running. But at some point, you have to stop running. You'll never outrun your past, no matter how far you go." Jack's eyes hardened, the words settling on him like a weight. He had tried to outrun his past for a long time. The things he'd done, the men he'd killed, the choices he had made. He couldn't escape them. Not completely. Not forever. "I don't need your advice," Jack said coldly, turning his gaze toward his horse, which stood tethered nearby, its breath fogging in the cold air. "I didn't ask for it." The stranger didn't move. He stood there, his eyes still fixed on Jack, but he didn't press the point. He wasn't here to fight Jack. Not today. "I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life," the stranger said after a moment, his voice softer. "But I can tell you this, they'll be coming for you. There are men who don't like it when someone walks into their town and takes down their boys. They'll want payback, and they'll find a way to get it." Jack's fingers twitched at his side, the familiar weight of his revolver reassuring him, but he didn't look at it. "I've handled worse." The stranger paused, looking at Jack with an almost sympathetic look in his eyes. "That's the thing about men like you," he said quietly. "You think you can handle everything, and maybe you can. But one day, it's gonna be too much. And when that happens, you won't be able to outrun it." Jack didn't respond. He mounted his horse, his eyes never leaving the stranger's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, the stranger tipped his hat and turned away. "Good luck, Jack. You'll need it." With that, the stranger faded into the storm, his silhouette disappearing into the blizzard as quickly as he had appeared. Jack didn't watch him leave. Instead, he kicked his horse into motion, heading out of Dry Creek and into the storm. He had no use for advice. His path was his own, and as the wind howled around him, Jack Talbot rode on, ready for whatever came next. Jack rode through the storm with his head low, the wind biting at his face, the snow swirling around him like a million tiny daggers. His horse moved steadily through the drifts, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves the only sound amidst the fury of the winter storm. Dry Creek was behind him now, a fading memory of violence and quick decisions. But Jack knew that the storm wasn't over, not by a long shot. It had been a while since he'd walked into a town and left such a mess behind. The bandits, the men who'd drawn their guns thinking they could outdraw him, were dead. But that didn't mean the trouble had ended. The stranger's words echoed in his mind as the wind howled around him. One day, it's gonna be too much. Jack had heard those kinds of warnings before. They were always the same. People who warned you from their own fear, their own regrets. But Jack didn't need to listen to the fearful. He needed to keep moving. The past was a place for ghosts, and Jack didn't have time to chase them. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that he was being followed. Even in the dead of night, in the blinding snow, Jack couldn't shake the sense that someone was tracking him. Someone who had the patience to wait and the skill to follow without being seen. Jack had learned long ago that you don't live as long as he had without developing a sixth sense for danger. And right now, that sense was prickling at the back of his neck. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the snow as he took a moment to look around. The blizzard had slowed a little, but the world was still a blur of white. The trees around him stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of the snow. It was the perfect cover for an ambush. Jack didn't draw his gun, but his hand rested lightly on the grip, ready. He wasn't about to let whoever was out there think they had the upper hand. He listened, his breath coming in steady puffs that formed clouds in the freezing air. The wind whistled through the branches, and the faint sound of the snow shifting beneath someone, caught his attention. Without a word, Jack turned toward the sound, moving as quietly as he could, his eyes scanning the trees. There was a shadow just off to the left, something that didn't belong. Jack's instinct screamed at him to act, but he held steady, his body tensed and ready. It was then that the figure stepped into view. A man, dressed in a thick coat, his face obscured by a scarf and wide-brimmed hat. He was just standing there, looking directly at Jack, as though he had been waiting for him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine. Jack's heart rate remained steady, but he knew that this was no random meeting. The man wasn't here by coincidence. "You've got a lot of nerve," Jack said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "You've been following me." The man didn't flinch. He simply stood there, hands resting casually at his sides. "I wasn't sure you'd notice me," he said, his voice gruff but not hostile. "I've been tracking you for a while. Figured it was only a matter of time before you noticed." Jack's hand moved to the revolver at his side, but he didn't draw it just yet. The man hadn't made any aggressive moves, and Jack didn't believe in wasting a shot. But he wasn't about to take any chances. "I don't need company," Jack said flatly, "and I'm not in the mood for games." The man stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching softly in the snow. "You're a hard man to miss, Jack Talbot. Word travels fast around these parts. You left a bit of a trail back in Dry Creek. Some people aren't too happy with how you handled things there." Jack's eyes narrowed. The last thing he needed was someone else trying to claim a bounty or avenge a dead friend. "You here to collect?" The stranger gave a slight shake of his head. "Not collecting, no. But I wouldn't be here if I wasn't paid to find you." Jack's hand went to his holster again, his fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. "You're gonna tell me who sent you?" The man didn't flinch, his eyes unwavering as he met Jack's stare. "Does it matter?" Jack's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't make the first move. Not yet. He had learned the hard way that letting emotions take over was a mistake. The storm swirled around them, the wind howling like an animal waiting for its prey, but Jack remained still. "Does it?" Jack asked again, his voice cold. The stranger let out a sigh, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I'm not here to fight you, Talbot. I'm just doing my job. There are people who want to make sure you don't get to walk away from Dry Creek without paying for what you did." Jack could feel the weight of the words settling over him. He had known it wouldn't be that easy. When you made a name for yourself, when you lived the kind of life Jack had, there were always people coming after you. People who thought they could use you as a stepping stone for their own gain. But Jack had made his choice long ago, and he didn't have time for anyone to try and change his path now. "I don't want any trouble," Jack said, his voice steady, the weight of the cold and the storm settling in his bones. But if you're here to make me pay, you're gonna regret it." The man's eyes flickered for a moment, like he was reconsidering his approach. But then, with a slight nod, he took a step back. "Maybe I was wrong. You don't seem like the kind of man who does things for money. But the people who hired me, they think you're trouble. And trouble out here tends to catch up with you." Jack didn't respond immediately, his hands still resting near his revolver. He knew the man had a job to do, and he wasn't going to waste his breath on words. The wind howled again, but Jack's thoughts were clear. If this stranger was backing off, he wasn't here to start a fight. At least, not yet. "You get paid, and you walk away," Jack said, his voice cold, resolute. "But if you cross me, I'll make sure you won't see the next sunrise." The stranger met Jack's gaze one last time, his eyes calculating, before he nodded. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the storm, his figure swallowed by the swirling snow. Jack remained still for a moment, his breath coming in short, steady bursts. He had survived worse than this. The storm raged around him, but for the first time that night, Jack felt like it was finally moving on. Jack turned back toward his horse, but as he mounted, he felt a new weight pressing down on him. The past wasn't done with him yet, and neither were the people looking to see him dead. Jack kicked his horse into motion, the wind still howling in his ears. The night was far from over. The storm grew colder as Jack rode deeper into the wilderness, the snow swirling violently around him like the breath of a great beast. The crunch of hooves in the snow was muffled by the thick winds, and the cold bit at his skin like thousands of sharp needles. His coat flapped in the wind, but his mind remained focused. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but that had always been the case. Jack didn't need to know where he was going. He just needed to stay ahead of whatever was following. The stranger's words still echoed in his mind, rattling around like loose gravel in his skull. "There are people who want to make sure you don't get to walk away from Dry Creek." Those words had stuck with him. People always wanted something, and in Jack's case, what they wanted was him dead. But that wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising anymore. Jack's past was a long, bloody list of enemies. He had spent most of his life running from it, hiding from the ghosts that kept chasing him. But that wasn't enough. He knew that. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many towns he left behind, there was always someone just behind him, waiting. He rode on through the storm, the horse's breath steaming in the air, its hooves sinking into the deep snow. Jack had no intention of stopping for the night. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble was waiting for him ahead, but he couldn't afford to rest just yet. Not with the way things had unfolded in Dry Creek. The stranger had given Jack one piece of valuable information, the knowledge that someone was coming for him. But Jack didn't need to wait for them. He was a man who had learned to be proactive. Ahead of him, the silhouette of a campfire flickered through the thickening storm. It was faint at first, but as Jack drew closer, the flames began to glow brighter, cutting through the darkness. He slowed his horse as he approached, his hand resting lightly on his revolver. The campfire could mean anything. Another drifter, a group of travelers, or worse, someone sent to track him down. He steered his horse toward the warmth of the fire, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. He didn't speak as he neared the camp, his boots crunching against the snow. His figure was barely visible against the swirling white, but he was used to the dark and the cold. He could sense when things weren't right. As Jack approached the fire, he could see a man sitting with his back turned to him. The stranger didn't seem to notice Jack's arrival, his attention focused on the small fire in front of him. Jack's instincts told him this man wasn't a threat. At least, not yet. But that didn't mean he was harmless. "Mind if I join you?" Jack asked, his voice quiet, but firm enough to carry over the wind. The man turned slowly, and Jack could see his face for the first time. The stranger was a rugged-looking fellow, weathered by years of hard travel, his face lined with the deep creases of a man who had spent more nights on the road than in the comfort of a home. His clothes were worn, his coat patched in places, but he looked like someone who had seen his share of danger. "Sure," the man replied gruffly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who wasn't used to talking. "Don't see too many folk out here in a storm like this. Thought you might be lost." Jack didn't move closer to the fire just yet. He kept a careful distance, studying the man with the same calm intensity he always used in moments like this. It was hard to trust anyone on the road. You couldn't let your guard down, not even for a moment. "I'm not lost," Jack said, his eyes scanning the stranger's face. "Just passing through." The man nodded, as if that explanation made sense. "Yeah, well, ain't many places to go around here unless you know the land. I'm on my way to town, but I'll be staying here tonight. Can't move through that storm much farther." Jack didn't speak right away. He just stood there for a moment, taking in the stranger's words and weighing his options. He could see the man wasn't armed, at least, not openly. But that didn't mean he was completely harmless. Jack had learned long ago not to judge a man by his appearance. You never knew who might be hiding a knife or a gun beneath their coat. "What brings you out here?" Jack asked after a pause, his voice quiet. He wasn't sure why he cared, but it was something to keep the conversation moving, something to keep his mind from wandering too much. The stranger shrugged, his face briefly darkening as he stared into the fire. "Nothing much. Just a man trying to make a living. The storm won't let me get any closer to town, though. Looks like I'll be stuck here for the night." Jack nodded, his hand still resting on the grip of his revolver. He wasn't going to let his guard down just yet, not with the storm still raging and the feeling that something was off hanging in the air. The stranger glanced up, his eyes narrowing as if sizing Jack up. "You don't talk much. The kind of man who keeps to himself, I reckon." Jack gave a slight nod. "I've learned that the less you say, the less you have to explain." The stranger chuckled softly, but it was a dry sound, the kind of laugh that had seen its fair share of hardships. "Ain't that the truth? Ain't nothing but trouble out here, no matter how much you try to keep to yourself. I've seen a lot of men come through this part of the world, and I can tell you, there's always someone looking to make a name for themselves at the expense of someone else." Jack's eyes flicked to the stranger, a hint of interest showing in his gaze. "Who's after you?" The stranger hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the horse tied to the tree just outside the fire's light. "Ain't nothing like that. Just the usual kind of trouble. Some folks don't take kindly to strangers on the road, especially ones who don't talk much." Jack could hear the unspoken meaning in the stranger's words. He didn't need to ask more questions. The man was running from something, or someone, but it wasn't Jack's concern. "Nothing like that around here," Jack said flatly. "Not tonight." The man met Jack's eyes then, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. Both of them were running from something, though neither of them cared to elaborate on what that something was. The wind howled louder, the storm roaring like an untamed beast outside. Jack turned his gaze toward the fire, his fingers gently brushing against his gun. He had a feeling that the calm they had now wouldn't last much longer. The storm was still out there, just as dangerous as the men who followed him. But for now, Jack had what he needed, a moment of peace. The man looked at Jack one more time before turning his attention back to the fire. Jack stayed silent. Both of them knew that the storm had more than one way of finding them. And so, they waited. The warmth from the fire crackled in the stillness, the heat drawing a faint shimmer in the cold air. But the storm outside continued to rage. Jack sat by the fire, his back to a tree, one hand resting lightly on his revolver, the other absently picking at the frayed edges of his coat. The man beside him didn't speak much after their brief exchange, but Jack didn't mind. There was something comforting in the silence. The way the wind outside made it feel like the world was a distant memory, and here, in this tiny corner of it, the two men were isolated from everything else. But Jack didn't trust isolation, not when it came to this kind of place. The stranger had made himself comfortable by the fire, but Jack had the distinct feeling that the man wasn't as relaxed as he appeared. His gaze darted from the flames to the trail behind them, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkened woods at any moment. Jack didn't know if it was the storm or his own instincts at work, but something in the air felt off. After a while, the stranger spoke again, his voice rough, as if the words had been stuck in his throat. "I told you about the trouble, right?" he asked, his eyes not quite meeting Jack's. "The people who are after me, and all that?" Jack didn't respond, just nodded in acknowledgement. He had already figured out that the stranger was running from something, but he didn't need to hear the details. Most men had their reasons for being on the run, and Jack knew better than to ask too many questions. He wasn't looking for company, and he certainly wasn't interested in getting dragged into another man's mess. The stranger's eyes flicked to Jack, gauging his response. Then, with a deep sigh, he continued, this time his voice lower, more cautious. I'm not the only one with a bounty on his head, the man said. People talk. You know, word spreads, and when it does, it doesn't take long before someone comes looking. A man can disappear for a while, but he can't outrun his past forever. There's always someone waiting. Someone who knows his name. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like where this was going. The stranger wasn't just talking about his own trouble anymore. He was making it clear that there were bigger forces at work, ones that could make life complicated for anyone who came too close to them. Jack wasn't one to get involved in other people's bounties or feuds, but the storm had made it impossible to keep moving, and the fire was warm. For now, there wasn't much else to do but listen. You think they're after you now? Jack asked, his voice steady. The stranger didn't respond right away. He stared into the fire, his face momentarily shadowed. Then, with a sigh, he shook his head. I'm sure of it. They've been tracking me for weeks now. Whoever they are, they're getting closer. I can feel it. Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He could feel it too. The air was thick with something, a weight Jack had learned to recognize after all these years. It was the feeling of men hunting you, the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was following your trail, waiting for the right moment to strike. You should leave, Jack said quietly, his eyes still on the stranger. If you know they're coming, you shouldn't be here. The stranger looked up, meeting Jack's gaze for the first time in a long while. There was a kind of sadness in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had been running too long and didn't know how much longer he could keep going. I've tried leaving, he said softly, but there's nowhere to run anymore. They know where I am. They've got their eyes on me. Jack could see the defeat in the man's posture. He wasn't looking for advice. He was looking for a way out of the life he had made, the one that had followed him for too long, like a shadow he couldn't shake. But Jack knew better than to offer false hope. Running never solved anything. You could keep moving, keep hiding, but eventually, the past would catch up to you. He had learned that lesson the hard way. You can't run from it, Jack said, his voice blunt. But you can face it. That's the only way it ends. The stranger seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes flicking to the ground. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of it doing little to ease the cold that had settled into his bones. Jack didn't expect him to respond, and he didn't. There was nothing more to say. The man's path had already been set, just as Jack's had. They sat in silence for a while longer, the storm outside now a constant roar in the background, like a living thing pushing against the walls of their little refuge. Jack didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. The time for words had passed. It was too late for explanations, too late for regrets. The world had a way of moving on, regardless of whether or not you were ready for it. As the fire dwindled to embers, Jack stood up, pulling his coat tighter around him as he surveyed the woods beyond their small camp. The storm still raged, but Jack knew it wouldn't last forever. The night was long, but dawn was coming, and with dawn, there would be more decisions to make. The stranger watched Jack for a moment before standing as well. I'll be leaving come morning, he said, his voice low. Don't know where, but I can't stay here. Jack nodded without saying anything. The decision had already been made, and there was no use in arguing with it. The road ahead was long, and if the man wanted to walk it, he would have to do it alone. As Jack gathered his things, he could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. The storm, the bounty hunters, the endless miles of empty road. It had all led to this. Another choice, another life to leave behind. The stranger mounted his horse and gave Jack one last, lingering look. Jack didn't return the glance. He didn't need to. The road ahead was calling him, and he wasn't going to keep waiting for trouble to catch up with him. Good luck, the stranger said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Jack didn't answer. Instead, he turned his horse and rode off into the storm, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Whatever was coming, whatever had been chasing him, he would face it in his own way. The world had no shortage of dangers, but Jack Talbot wasn't one to back down from a fight. And as the snow continued to fall, Jack rode on, the storm howling at his back, but his resolve unbroken. The storm had not yet run its course. Jack rode through it like he had so many others before. The wind lashed at his face, but he didn't flinch. He had spent too much of his life in the wilderness, fighting the elements and the shadows of his past. The blizzard felt like just another challenge, one he could ignore as he kept his eyes on the road ahead. Dry Creek was behind him now, a fading memory swallowed by the storm. But the trouble that had begun there wasn't something Jack could leave behind. It was always waiting, just a step behind him. He had known that, accepted that, but he wasn't in a hurry to face it again. Not yet. As Jack rode, his mind wandered back to the conversation with the stranger by the fire. It had been a fleeting moment, a brief exchange between two men who understood the rules of survival. They had shared a silence, an acknowledgement that life on the road wasn't meant to be easy. But Jack had no interest in getting involved with a man's past, especially when it was already too late to change. His road was his own, and anyone who tried to join it would have to figure that out for themselves. But now, as the storm continued to howl around him, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had felt it back at the camp, in the way the stranger had looked at him, like he had known something Jack didn't. But Jack didn't trust easy answers. He never had. The snow piled up around his horse's hooves, each step forward leaving a trace in the snow that would be covered by the next gust of wind. The landscape around him was empty, silent, a vast stretch of white that went on endlessly, like a canvas waiting for something to stain it. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the low sound of hooves in the distance. He pulled his horse to a stop, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his revolver. The figure in the distance was barely visible through the snow, but Jack could tell that it wasn't another drifter like himself. The rider was moving too fast, too deliberately. Someone had been waiting for him. Jack squinted against the wind, trying to make out the silhouette. As the rider drew closer, Jack's fingers tightened on the revolver, ready to draw, ready for whatever was coming. The figure broke through the storm's veil, and Jack's instincts kicked in, his hand already moving for his weapon. But then he stopped. The rider wasn't coming for him. He wasn't even looking his way. It was a woman. She rode a chestnut mare, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a thick scarf wrapped around her neck. She was dressed in the same weathered clothes as any other traveler on the frontier, but there was something about her posture, the way she held herself in the saddle, that made Jack pause. She didn't stop as she neared him, not even slowing down. But Jack's sharp eyes caught the briefest flicker of recognition as she passed him. A fleeting glance, nothing more. It lasted just a second, but it was enough. Jack's hand twitched at his side, and then he felt it, the presence, the weight of someone who had known him. She was one of them. She was part of the reason he was always running. Before Jack could even think to call out, she had vanished back into the snowstorm, her horse's hooves kicking up small flurries of snow as she disappeared into the swirling white. Jack stood still for a long moment, watching the empty space where she had been, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know who she was, but he knew enough. She had recognized him, and she hadn't stopped. That wasn't a coincidence. Jack mounted his horse quickly, the cold wind snapping at his face as he urged his mare forward. He wasn't going to follow her. He wasn't sure what she wanted, but it didn't matter. He had his own path to follow, and if she was part of the trouble that was catching up with him, then she would have to wait. For now, the road was still his. The next few hours passed in silence, the snow falling steadily, the world blanketed in white. Jack rode on, his mind racing, but his body calm. He had learned long ago not to let his thoughts distract him, not to let them sway his movements. He was in control. But then, just as the day began to fade into twilight, something shifted in the air. Jack could feel it. Something subtle, something dangerous. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the sound of hooves reached his ears again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was following him. Jack didn't slow down, but his hand moved toward his revolver, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The sound of the approaching rider grew louder, closer, but Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead. He didn't need to look behind him. He didn't need to see who it was. He knew what they wanted. The The rider drew even with him, pulling up alongside Jack's horse without a word. It was the same woman from before, and this time, she didn't pass him. She stayed just far enough to make sure Jack knew she was there. "I thought you might keep running," she said, her voice low, but it carried easily over the wind. "But you can't outrun everything, Jack." Jack didn't look at her, his face a mask of indifference, but he could feel her eyes on him, cold and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. Her mare's hooves clicked softly in the snow as she kept pace with him. "You're following me," Jack said flatly. "I don't know who you are, but I don't need your company." The woman's lips curved into a faint smile, though it wasn't a friendly one. "Does it matter who I am? I'm the one who's been sent to make sure you don't get too far." Jack's eyes narrowed. He had suspected it. He had felt the weight of the world on him from the moment he stepped into that damn town. But now, it was clear. Whoever had sent this woman wasn't going to let him slip away unnoticed. "You're not getting in my way," Jack said, his voice like ice. The woman chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the wind. "We'll see about that." And with that, she spurred her horse forward, leaving Jack to follow at his own pace. The storm had stopped being just an inconvenience. Now, it was the least of his worries. Jack's mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. He wouldn't run. Not from her. Not from anyone. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let someone like her stop him now. The snow had started to clear as the last of the storm rolled out, but the cold lingered. Jack's breath puffed in white clouds as he urged his horse on, keeping pace with the woman who had so abruptly appeared beside him. The wind had died down somewhat, but the silence between them was far louder than the storm had ever been. Jack kept his eyes ahead, trying to gauge what her next move would be. The woman had spurred her horse ahead, and now she was pushing hard, trying to widen the gap between them. Jack could see the shape of her figure in the distance, riding fast and with purpose. Whoever had sent her knew what they were doing. They had trained her well. She wasn't just some random hired gun. There was something cold and calculated in the way she moved. Jack had no illusions about her intentions. She wasn't here to chat. She wasn't here to make peace. She had orders, and those orders were to stop him from going any further. He had already decided that he wasn't going to let her, and with that, the chase had begun. He kicked his horse harder, leaning forward to close the distance. The woman's horse was fast, but Jack knew his own was just as capable. His mare had seen enough trouble on the trail to handle anything this woman could throw at her. Still, he knew better than to assume anything. This was no regular chase. This was a fight for survival. If he didn't catch up with her before she could disappear into the night, it could very well be the end of his journey. He could feel the familiar knot of tension tightening in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd gotten back in Dry Creek, that sense of urgency that always made him move faster, think faster. It was the kind of pressure he'd lived with for years, and it was something he had learned to thrive under. But now, it felt different. The stakes were higher. The past had caught up to him, and the woman ahead of him was the messenger. As he pushed his horse forward, Jack couldn't help but wonder how much of this woman's mission was personal. Who had sent her? And why had they chosen her? It didn't matter much to him at the moment. What mattered was that she was here, and Jack Talbot wasn't about to let anyone take him down, not without a fight. The distance between them was closing, but the woman wasn't slowing down. Her horse's hooves pounded against the snow with relentless precision, and Jack could see the faint outline of a rifle strapped to her back. She was prepared for a fight, just like he was. But Jack had one advantage. He wasn't afraid of dying. As Jack pushed closer, he could see the woman's head turn, just enough to catch a glimpse of him. She hadn't expected him to close the gap so quickly, and for a moment, her eyes widened, calculating whether she had time to make her next move. Jack wasn't about to let her decide for him. He gripped the reins tighter, spurring his horse faster, the wind biting at his face. The woman looked over her shoulder, then jerked the reins, urging her horse into a sharper turn, trying to force him off course. But Jack was already there. He didn't wait for her to pull away again. With a quick pull of the reins, he veered his horse into the same direction, now running parallel with her. The two horses galloped side by side, the pounding of hooves the only sound in the silent night. Jack knew this moment was critical. He didn't want to kill her, but he wasn't going to let her win. There was no turning back now. He pulled his revolver from its holster, holding it low at his side, his eyes fixed on the woman's back. He could feel the weight of his decision, the sharp edge of what was about to happen. "You're not going to stop me," Jack shouted over the wind, his voice steady. "You can keep running, but it won't change anything." The woman didn't respond, but Jack could see her hand move toward her rifle, her fingers brushing the cold steel. She wasn't going to back down either. This was it. They were both in the middle of a deadly game, and only one of them would walk away. The two horses raced through the snow, their breath steaming in the cold air. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The chase, the fight. Jack could feel the weight of the moment. Every second, every beat of his heart, every movement of his mare. Without warning, the woman turned sharply to her right, trying to force Jack off course. She was quick, but Jack's reaction was faster. He leaned low in the saddle, and with a practiced motion, his mare adjusted just in time to keep them on the same path. He wasn't going to let her dictate where this fight went. "You're out of options," Jack called, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. The woman's eyes flashed with something cold, something deadly. She pulled her rifle from her back, aiming it at Jack. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he saw her raise it, but in that split second, he was already drawing his own gun. His Colt .45 was steady in his hand, the familiar weight settling perfectly in his palm. He didn't hesitate. His finger pulled the trigger, the sound of the shot exploding in the air. The woman's rifle jerked from her hands as the bullet hit the wood of her gun. The force of the shot made her flinch, but she didn't fall. She was still riding, still in control. Jack didn't give her a chance to recover. He aimed again, this time for the horse. The bullet hit the mare's flank, and the animal screamed, rearing up on its hind legs. The woman fought to keep control, but Jack had already closed the distance, his gun steady. The horse collapsed, sending the woman tumbling into the snow, her body landing with a thud. Jack's horse came to a halt beside her, and Jack dismounted, keeping his revolver aimed at her. She lay in the snow, panting and cursing under her breath, but she wasn't moving to get up. Jack kept his distance, his eyes scanning for any other movement, any sign that this wasn't over. The woman glared at him, but there was no fear in her eyes, just anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she spat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This won't end with me. There's always more of us." Jack's expression hardened, his gun still aimed at her. "I've been dealing with men like you for a long time. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." She didn't answer, but Jack didn't need her to. He already knew that she wasn't done, that there were more waiting for him, watching him from the shadows. But Jack had faced worse, and he wasn't about to stop now. Jack stood over the fallen woman, his revolver steady in his hand as he looked down at her, her face twisted in both pain and defiance. The wind still howled, swirling the snow around them like ghosts of the past. But in this moment, all Jack could hear was the sound of her shallow breathing. He didn't want to kill her. He hadn't come out here to fight, but there were moments when you had no choice but to draw the line. She wasn't an innocent bystander, and she knew the risks. "You're not gonna kill me," she spat, her voice hoarse but steady despite the pain. "You won't make it past the next town without someone coming for you." Jack didn't answer her right away. He was used to threats. He'd heard worse, seen worse. But there was something in her tone, something in the way she looked at him that made him hesitate for just a split second. She wasn't just a hired gun. She had conviction in her eyes. That kind of fire, the kind that came from believing in something larger than yourself, was dangerous. And Jack knew it would follow him, just like everything else that had come before it. "You're right," Jack said finally, his voice low. "I won't make it far, but I'll get farther than you." He slowly lowered his revolver but kept it in his hand, ready in case she made a move. He didn't trust her. Not now. Not ever. But he wasn't going to finish her off coldly. That wasn't the kind of man he was. He knew better. The woman's hand twitched near her belt, but she seemed to think better of it. She wasn't fast enough to make a real move before Jack could react, but she seemed content to lie there, staring up at him with those burning eyes. "I wasn't hired to take you alive," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "But I guess it doesn't matter now." Jack didn't respond. He turned away, his eyes scanning the horizon as he walked back to his horse. There was nothing left for him in this place. Nothing but a trail of bodies and a past that wouldn't leave him alone. Before he mounted his horse, he glanced back at her, still lying in the snow. She was breathing heavily, but she was alive. For now, don't make this worse for yourself, he said. You're not dead yet, but you will be if you don't move. He didn't wait for her reply. Jack wasn't a man who gave second chances to people who wouldn't make it worth his time. He turned his horse and rode off, his mare's hooves crunching in the fresh snow, leaving the woman behind in the cold. The world was wide, and Jack knew better than to waste time. He had his own road to follow, and the storm had passed. But something about the encounter lingered in his mind. The woman wasn't the kind of person you forget easily. He didn't know her story, didn't care to, but he had learned that people like her rarely worked alone. There were others out there, men and women who wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And Jack wasn't the kind of man to let them get it. As he rode through the snow-covered landscape, Jack couldn't help but wonder if he'd see her again. He had left her alive, sure, but that didn't mean the story was over. He had seen too many men and women rise from the dead like ghosts, their vengeance sharper than any blade. He wasn't about to wait around for that to happen. The road stretched out ahead of him, the horizon a dull gray that blended into the snow and the sky. Jack pushed his horse forward, the rhythmic motion of the mare's steps a constant hum in his ears. His destination didn't matter, not tonight. It was just another night on the road. Another night of running from the past and into whatever the future would bring. It wasn't long before the sound of hooves broke through the quiet of the night. Jack didn't need to look behind him. He had been expecting this. The trail he had left in the snow was an easy one to follow, and he knew that whoever was after him wouldn't be far behind. The sound of the rider grew louder, closer. Jack's hand hovered near the grip of his revolver again, his fingers twitching with the familiar anticipation. He wasn't surprised. He never was. But the world had a way of surprising him just the same. The rider appeared in the distance, a shadow at first, but soon enough, Jack could make out the details. A lone figure, tall and broad-shouldered, riding fast. There was no mistaking the approach. It was another one of them. Another person sent to finish the job. The rider pulled up alongside Jack, and this time, there was no hesitation. The man didn't even give Jack a chance to speak before drawing his weapon. "You're Jack Talbot, right?" the man asked, his voice gruff and low. He didn't look at Jack, but his eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the road as if expecting something. Jack didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. The man wasn't asking for a friendly conversation. His tone was clear. This was another bounty hunter, another obstacle. "I don't know who's been sending you all after me, but you're wasting your time," Jack said flatly. The man didn't seem to care about Jack's words. He didn't slow down or even acknowledge them. He just turned slightly toward Jack, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "The name's Ben Walker, and I'm here to bring you in. Dead or alive, it doesn't matter to me." Jack's hand tightened on his revolver, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. Ben Walker wasn't like the others. He had the cold, hardened look of someone who had been hunting for a long time. The look of a man who had seen too much blood spilled to care about the price. "I don't take kindly to threats," Jack said, his voice low, dangerous. Walker just chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You'll learn to like it. You don't have much of a choice." Before Walker could make a move, Jack acted. The crack of Jack's revolver was deafening in the stillness of the night, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. Walker's gunshot was cut short, his body jerking back as the bullet hit his chest. His hand dropped to his side, and he slumped in the saddle, his horse stopping immediately as it sensed its rider's fall. Jack's horse slowed to a stop as well, but Jack didn't dismount. He watched the man fall, his body hitting the snow with a soft thud. The world was quiet again, except for the sound of the wind, still howling in the distance. Jack didn't waste time looking at Walker's lifeless body. He had already decided what needed to be done. The man was just another name on the long list of people who had tried to kill him, and Jack had no intention of being part of that list. He had lived long enough to know how the story played out. He kicked his horse into motion again, the steady rhythm of hooves once more cutting through the stillness of the night. The road ahead was uncertain, the storm still in his past, but Jack wasn't going to let the world catch up with him. Not yet. Not until he was ready to face whatever came next. The road stretched out in front of Jack, a ribbon of snow and dirt carved through the wilderness, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the silence press in around him. His revolver still hung low at his side, his hand never straying far from the grip. He had learned that in moments like this, when the world seemed eerily still, danger was only a heartbeat away. The body of Ben Walker lay in the snow behind him, but Jack didn't slow his horse. He didn't stop to wonder if the man's death would draw others. He knew it would. The bounty on his head wasn't just a mark for those who sought money. It was a target for anyone who thought they could make a name for themselves by bringing him down. But Jack wasn't running from this. He had never run from a fight. He just kept moving. His horse moved steadily through the snow, the wind picking up again, howling around him as if the storm refused to let him go. The world was cold, and Jack's thoughts were colder. He had no destination in mind, only the road ahead. The land out here was vast, empty, perfect for someone like him who wanted to disappear into it. But Jack knew better. It didn't matter where you went. People followed. They always did. The wind had begun to bite harder, and the first sign of twilight was creeping into the sky when Jack spotted the smoke. It was faint at first, just a thin trail against the pale blue. But it was there, a sign of life. As he drew closer, Jack saw the small, ramshackle settlement sitting at the base of a ridge, its buildings hunched together as if trying to shield themselves from the elements. A few figures moved in and out of sight. Hard men, probably, men who lived on the fringes of civilization. Jack wasn't sure what they were doing out here, but he knew better than to think they were just farmers or traders. This was a place where the law didn't reach, and that was the kind of place Jack had learned to avoid. But he didn't have much choice. There was no room for hesitation out here in the cold. He needed shelter, and this was the only place nearby. He guided his horse toward the settlement, careful to stay alert. His fingers brushed the handle of his revolver again, the familiar weight reassuring. There was something about this place, something off about the way the figures in the settlement moved. They were too aware of each other, too cautious. It wasn't like a town, where people went about their business. Here, everyone seemed to be watching. Jack rode into the heart of the settlement slowly, his eyes flicking from one figure to the next. He kept his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He wasn't here to make trouble. He just needed to get out of the storm. But the people in the settlement had already noticed him, and there was no disguising the fact that he didn't belong. A man stepped out of one of the buildings, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked toward Jack. The man was tall, his face hardened by years of life on the frontier. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned Jack from head to toe. He didn't look scared. He looked like someone who had seen too much to be scared anymore. "You lost, stranger?" the man asked, his voice rough with the grit of someone used to dealing with travelers. Jack didn't answer immediately. He gave the man a long look, assessing him. His hand remained near his revolver, but he didn't draw it. "Not yet. I'm just passing through," Jack said finally, his voice steady, neutral, just looking for shelter from the storm. The man eyed him for a moment longer, as if considering whether Jack was telling the truth. "This isn't the kind of place for passing through," he said. "Not unless you've got a reason to be here." Jack's gaze sharpened slightly. The man's tone had changed, becoming more guarded, like he wasn't sure if he wanted Jack here or not. It was a subtle shift, but Jack had lived too long in places like this not to notice. "I don't need trouble," Jack said, his voice low, almost to himself. "I just need a roof over my head for the night." The man looked at him for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "Fine, but don't go thinking you're gonna make yourself at home. We don't like strangers around here. You're welcome to stay the night, but that's it." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man had made it clear that he didn't want to see Jack sticking around for long. Jack dismounted, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to make anyone nervous. The settlement wasn't big, maybe 20 or 30 people at most, but it felt like a lot more when every one of them was watching him. He didn't want to make trouble. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, but the truth was, he couldn't keep running forever. The storm had thrown him off track, and for the first time in a while, Jack felt like he needed to stop, just for a moment. He led his horse to a small stable near the edge of the settlement, his hand still on the grip of his revolver. He wasn't foolish enough to think this place would be free of danger. These people didn't trust outsiders, and Jack wasn't exactly the kind of man you invited to dinner. He knew he had to keep his wits about him. As Jack finished tending to his horse, he turned back toward the settlement, the cold air biting at his face. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew that for tonight, he would be safe. Or so he thought. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Someone was approaching him, quick, silent, almost too swift to be noticed. Jack's hand went to his revolver, but before he could draw, a voice stopped him. "You're Jack Talbot, aren't you?" The voice was low and familiar, and Jack froze. He didn't need to turn around. He recognized that voice. The last person he wanted to see was standing right behind him. Jack's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as the words settled in the cold air. He knew that voice. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was, but he did anyway. Slowly, deliberately, as if he were preparing himself for something he wasn't quite ready to face. There she stood. The woman who had ridden beside him in the snow, the one who had vanished without a word, was now standing directly behind him. Her figure was just as he remembered, tall, cold-eyed, her posture as rigid as ever. She wore a dark coat that blended into the night, and her face was partially covered by the same scarf she'd worn before. But Jack didn't need to see it to know who she was. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the way she looked at him, and now, here she was again. Jack's hand hovered just above his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. She hadn't drawn on him, and he had learned a long time ago that it was better to talk first, shoot second. "You followed me," Jack said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "You were supposed to leave me alone." The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her boots crunching in the snow, and Jack felt a shift in the air around him. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't a chance encounter. She had come for a reason, and that reason wasn't to chat. "You didn't think I'd let you go that easily, did you?" Her voice was soft, but there was steel behind it. "You've made a lot of enemies, Jack. You can't just leave a trail of dead men behind and think it won't catch up with you." Jack didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. He had been warned 1,000 times about the people who would come after him. And now, here she was, another reminder that there was always a price to pay for the things he had done. "I'm not interested in your vengeance," Jack said flatly, his eyes scanning the settlement behind her. The people in the town were still watching, still waiting. But no one moved. No one interfered. Jack wasn't sure if that meant they didn't care, or if they were too afraid to get involved. Either way, it didn't matter. "I'm not asking for vengeance," she replied, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm just here to finish what started in Dry Creek. You should have stayed gone, Jack. You should have stayed out of it. But now, you've made yourself a target, and I'm here to make sure the job gets done." Jack took a step back, the cold wind stinging his face, but his mind was focused. He wasn't going to let her dictate what happened next. He had made a choice long ago. He had made peace with it. But now, the world had come knocking, and Jack wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, even when it seemed like everything was against him. "You want me to go back to Dry Creek?" Jack asked, his voice low. "You want me to face whatever's left of those men?" "It's too late for that." The woman stepped forward again, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife at her side. "It's never too late, Jack, but you can't keep running from your past. Sooner or later, it'll catch up with you." Jack's fingers brushed against the grip of his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He was watching her closely, gauging her every movement. She wasn't trying to draw him into a fight. Not yet, at least. But Jack knew better than to trust the calm before the storm. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Jack said, his voice steady but warning. "I don't want to kill you, but I will if I have to." The woman's lips twitched into a small, almost pitying smile. "You think you can scare me? You think a man like you has the power to intimidate me?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tension between them was thick enough to cut through with a knife. She was here to finish what had started in Dry Creek, but Jack wasn't going to let that happen. Not if he could help it. "I'm not your enemy," Jack said, his voice low and almost regretful. "But I'm not going to let you stand in my way." Without warning, the woman moved. It was so fast, Jack barely had time to react. Her hand shot out toward her belt, and in the blink of an eye, a small, curved knife was in her hand. She moved with the precision of someone who had trained for years, a practiced fluidity that Jack knew all too well. Jack didn't hesitate. His hand was already on his revolver, and in one swift motion, the gun was out and aimed at her chest. "I warned you," Jack said, his voice calm, but there was no mistaking the edge in it. "Stay down." The woman stopped in her tracks, her knife still in hand, but she didn't make another move. The two of them stood there for a long moment, the cold wind swirling around them, the tension between them almost tangible. Her eyes locked onto his, and Jack could see the conflict in them, the hesitation, the acknowledgement that they were both standing on the edge of something dangerous. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging just slightly. "You're right. I should have listened." Jack didn't lower his gun. Not just yet. He kept his eyes on her, waiting for any sign that she might make another move. But she didn't. She just stood there, her knife now hanging loosely at her side. "I'm not going to fight you, Jack," she said quietly, her voice softer now. "Not today." Jack didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, waiting for the next move. The silence between them stretched for a long time before he finally lowered his revolver, his hand still tense around the grip, but not quite ready to pull the trigger. The woman turned slowly, her footsteps soft in the snow as she began to walk away. "Don't follow me," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You won't like where it leads." She paused for just a moment, then turned her head back to face him, her eyes still hard but tinged with something almost like regret. "I won't. But don't think this is over, Jack. It's never over." With that, she turned and disappeared into the night, her figure swallowed by the snowstorm, leaving Jack alone once again. Jack stood there for a moment longer, his breath coming in slow, steady breaths, his fingers still tense around the grip of his revolver. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was long, and the past was never too far behind. But Jack Talbot wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. The woman was gone, but her words lingered in the cold night air. "It's never over, Jack. It's never over." They echoed in his mind like a persistent whisper, cutting through the stillness around him. The snow fell softly, covering the traces of her departure, but Jack knew better than to think he was truly alone. The storm had passed, but something much worse had begun to unfold. Jack mounted his horse, his hands tight around the reins, his thoughts a swirling mess of uncertainty. The woman, her name, her face, her intentions, all of it was a mystery. But the one thing Jack knew for sure was that she wasn't the last of them. She was just one of many. He had a past full of enemies, and it had come calling again. There was no running from it. Not now. As he urged his horse forward, Jack didn't look back at the settlement. The people there had watched him, but none had made a move. They were either too afraid or too indifferent to get involved. They were just like so many others Jack had encountered before. They lived their lives on the edge of the world, keeping their heads down, waiting for trouble to pass them by. But trouble didn't pass. It always came back. And when it did, it would find you, no matter how far you tried to run. The cold wind stung Jack's face as he rode, but the storm had cleared, and the moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the snow-covered ground. He could feel the weight of every step his horse took, the rhythm of it both comforting and unsettling. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he knew he couldn't stay in one place for long. If that woman had followed him this far, there were likely more on his trail, and he wasn't about to give them the chance to catch up. It wasn't long before he came across another rider. This time, Jack saw the figure in the distance. A man riding hard, his silhouette cutting through the moonlit snow. Jack didn't need to guess. The rider was coming for him. The way the man was moving, the way he was closing the distance, told Jack everything he needed to know. This wasn't a traveler. This wasn't someone lost in the storm. This was someone with purpose, someone who knew exactly who they were looking for. Jack's hand went to his revolver. He didn't draw it yet, but his fingers hovered over the grip. He wasn't going to wait for the man to make the first move. He wasn't going to let anyone else think they could walk all over him. As the rider drew closer, Jack could make out the details. He was tall, lean, and his coat was black, almost blending in with the night. The rider's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but the faint glint of a rifle slung across his back caught Jack's eye. When the man was within shouting distance, he slowed his horse, drawing to a stop just a few feet away from Jack. His eyes, sharp and cold, locked onto Jack's without hesitation. "You're Jack Talbot, aren't you?" the man asked, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "I've been looking for you." Jack didn't answer immediately. He just studied the man, his eyes narrowing slightly. He could feel the familiar tension rising in the air, the kind of tension that always preceded a fight. "I'm Jack," he said finally, his voice steady. "What do you want?" The man's lips curled slightly at the corners, but there was no humor in it. "I'm here to make sure you don't make it out of this alive." Jack's eyes flashed with the same sharpness as his words. "You're not the first to say that." The man's smile faded, and he slid a hand toward the rifle on his back. "You think I'm joking?" he said, his voice growing colder. "You've got a price on your head, Talbot, and I'm here to collect." Jack didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. Every bounty hunter who had come after him had said the same thing. But this man was different. Jack could feel it in the way he moved, the way he looked at him. He wasn't just another hired gun. He was something else, something colder. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Jack didn't want to kill this man, but he knew that if he didn't act now, he'd be the one dead on the snow-covered ground. The man's hand had nearly wrapped around his rifle when Jack made his move. It was fast, too fast. In a blink, Jack's revolver was out and aimed at the man's chest. The gunshot rang out in the night, louder than the wind, louder than the storm that had passed. The bullet hit the man square in the chest, and he was thrown backward off his horse, landing in the snow with a sickening thud. Jack didn't move for a moment, watching the body for any sign of life, but the man didn't get up. The cold air seemed to absorb the sound of the shot, and the world around him felt as still as the snow beneath his feet. Jack holstered his revolver and took a deep breath. Another life ended. Another bounty hunter who wouldn't make it back to claim his reward. Jack wasn't sure how many more there would be. How many more people would be sent after him? He had already survived too many to count, but the price on his head never seemed to go down. The people who wanted him dead had the resources to keep sending others after him, and Jack had no way of knowing how long that would last. He mounted his horse again, his eyes scanning the area, knowing the quiet wouldn't last long. There was always someone else, someone waiting in the wings to take their turn. But Jack wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. He urged his horse forward, and as he rode into the night, the wind howling in his ears, Jack felt the weight of his past settling on his shoulders again. There was no escaping it, not completely, but that wasn't going to stop him. He had made his choice, and now he would face whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.